Good afternoon. Welcome to the Labor Forum here on WRFG 89.3 FM in Atlanta. That song that starts this program off is obviously We Do the Work by John Fromer, and it comes from a CD of the same title. My name is Diane Mathewitz. I'm a retired auto worker, and I want to thank everybody who in the last several occasions where we've been out and about in the community where people have been so gracious to talk about how much they appreciate this program and how much they enjoy the Labor Forum, and that always makes those of us here, Paul and I, feel really good about the effort that we put in to bring you the news that you're not really going to get on the corporate media. So the opinions that are expressed on this program may not necessarily be those of the Board of Directors, staff, or volunteers here at WRFG, but as I always say, the mission of this station is, in fact, to present the issues, the culture, the solutions to problems in the voices of the folks that are affected by them. And certainly, we know that the impact of this economic system, political system, social system on workers is immense and has created numerous problems, and we try to raise those here at the Labor Forum. So, hi, Paul.
Hi, Diane.
So we will start off after just say a few things. You know, we have a website now. It's WRFG laborforum.org. Please do go to it to stay in touch with, you know, events, and we post all kinds of things on there. We also have a Twitter, and we also have a Facebook, and we have now Labor Forum Worker Power T-shirts, and we will be having those available when we come out to different community events, and we hope that you would like to wear one and help promote, support WRFG in the Labor Forum. Now, one of the other things that we have to talk about is it's 2 weeks today, or maybe it's even a little longer, that we have been having all these technical difficulties here at the station, and it has been extraordinarily frustrating for the staff and the volunteers here that because of technology supplied to us, or perhaps not so supplied to us, by a major corporation that everybody knows. We have been off the air and intermittent on the air, and we have been working diligently and as hard as we can to get this resolved. And so the fact that you're able to hear us today is in part because we've been somewhat successful in getting these issues figured out. So we're going to start our program as we do with our two segments, the labor headlines and then this week in labor history. So here are the labor headlines for June 8, 2015. In international news, effective June 1st, Venezuelan teachers received a 50% raise in their salaries. Approximately 713,231 education workers will benefit from the increase. The Venezuelan government has also allocated funds to pay pension benefits to 15,000 retired teachers who didn't receive their full payments last year. The General Secretary of the Union of Bolivarian Socialist Workers commented that this is, quote, further proof that the Bolivarian Revolution guarantees the social and contractual rights of all our workers. Last year, the World Bank, no friend, really, to any progressive government, ranked Venezuela among the top 10 nations in the whole world for the highest education spending percentages of GNP, or gross national product. You may recall that on March 9th, President Obama declared Venezuela, quote, a national security threat, close quote, to the U.S. and placed additional sanctions against the country. This follows a pattern of direct and indirect U.S. interference in Venezuela's internal affairs, including support for the 2002 failed coup against President Hugo Chavez, and at least $14 million to fund electoral opposition groups between 2013 and 2014 that mounted violent protests to prevent the election of Nicolas Maduro, by the way, whose presidential victory was not acknowledged by the U.S. Some of the accomplishments of the Bolivarian Revolution that so-called terrorized the corporate and political bosses of the U.S. is the tuition-free education from daycare to university level, which has Venezuela with the 5th highest percentage of university students in the world. A side note, today's AJC has a front page article about the $1 million salaries to presidents of Georgia's public universities, awarded at the same time as unaffordable tuition and fees cause thousands of students to go into massive debt, and professors and staff salaries can be at poverty levels. Now for some national news, the Labor Forum is happy to report on a string of victories for domestic workers, such as nannies, housekeepers, and home health care workers. Oregon and Connecticut have recently enacted Domestic Worker Bill of Rights legislation that provides a level of protection for these workers not covered under the National Labor Relations Act. In addition, on May 30th, the Illinois House passed similar legislation, which now goes to that state's Senate. The laws vary somewhat, but they all provide for domestic workers to be paid no less than the minimum wage, have at least one day off a week, and be granted meal and rest periods. There are provisions for overtime and protection against physical, verbal, and sexual abuse. It's kind of astonishing that it takes a Domestic Workers Bill of Rights to guarantee these fundamental things. These states now join Massachusetts, New York, Hawaii, and California in extending labor rights to domestic workers. And here in Atlanta, fast food and low-wage workers have been on the move all over the last weeks, joining thousands of their fellow workers and allies at the McDonald's stockholders meeting May 21-22 in Chicago, where a delegation of workers submitted a petition with 1 million signatures demanding $15 an hour and the right to join a union. Then this past weekend, an Atlanta group attended the 3rd National Conference of the Fight for $15 an hour movement in Detroit. There was a solidarity rally and send-off action at a McDonald's on Friday, June 5th on Virginia Avenue. At the conference, workers celebrated a number of victories from their historic campaign that is just over 2.5 years old, including numerous city and state laws to increase wages, to corporations like Walmart and McDonald's making minimal concessions to the workers' demands. In addition, New York State and Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, has convened a wage board to evaluate and make recommendations to increase the minimum wage there. The struggle has not yet been won in full, but there is no doubt that this campaign has aroused millions to connect the prevalence of low wages, the shocking disparity between rich and poor, and the epidemic of police killings and mass incarceration that plague working class and poor communities. And those are our labor headlines for today. We're going to move right on to Paul McLennan, who's retired ATU worker with MARTA, who does our fantastic This Week in Labor History. Hi, Paul.
Thanks, Diane. This week, on the morning of June 12th, 1963, at 12:40 a.m., NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers arrived home from a long organizing meeting at the New Jerusalem Baptist Church in Jackson, Mississippi. He got out of his car, arms filled with Jim Crow Musco t-shirts, and walked toward his kitchen door when a shot was fired from a high-powered rifle, striking him in the back. His wife, Merle, heard the shot, ran outside with her children behind her, and saw Medgar lying face down in the carport. Next-door neighbor Houston Wells heard the shot and called the police. The police arrived and provided an escort as Wells drove Evers to the emergency room of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. He died less than an hour later from loss of blood and internal injuries. Mississippi had become a major theater of struggle during the Black Freedom Movement of the 1950s and 60s. Between 1952 and 1963, Medgar Wiley Evers was one of the state's most impassioned activists, orators, and visionaries for change. He was born July 2nd, 1925 in Decatur, Mississippi, and was one of 4 children born to James and Jessie Evers. His father worked in a sawmill, and his mother was a domestic worker. He attended all black schools in the segregated public school system of Newton County. Segregated public education meant long walks to school for the Evers children. The schools had few resources and operated with outdated textbooks, few teachers, large classes, and small classrooms without laboratories and supplies. At the end of his sophomore year of high school, and several months before his 18th birthday, Evers volunteered and was inducted into the United States Army in 1942. During his tour of duty in World War II, Evers was assigned to and served with a segregated port battalion. In June 1944, Evers' unit was part of the massive post-D-Day invasion of Europe, and he served in both France and Germany until his honorable discharge in 1946. Though typical at the time, racial segregation in the military only served to anger Evers. By the end of the war, Evers was among a generation of black veterans committed to answering W.E.B. Du Bois's clarion call to return home fighting for change. He spent the next years preparing to become part of the vanguard for change in Mississippi. He returned to school to complete his education under the military's GI Bill. While in school, he met Merle Beasley, and on Christmas Eve 1951, they were married. Merle soon realized after meeting him that he was a rebel at heart. He was ready, she said, to put his beliefs to any test. He saw a much larger world than the one that for the moment confined him, but he aspired to be a part of that world. Working together, they helped to establish local chapters of the NAACP throughout the Mississippi Delta. He also encouraged the involvement of younger activists in local youth councils across the state. The inclusion of youth, Evers believed, was critical to a winning strategy. In 1954, he became the NAACP's first full-time state field secretary, monitoring, collecting, and publicizing data concerning civil rights violations. Following the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till, Medgar Evers and two other field workers, Ruby Hurley and Amzie Moore, tracked down potential witnesses to the events leading up to and including Till's abduction. They convinced several people to come forward, keeping them in protective custody when they testified at the 1955 trial of two men accused of killing Till, and then shepherded them out of town in secrecy when the all-white jury returned a verdict of not guilty after deliberating for just an hour. During the 1950s, white Mississippians responded with massive violent resistance and terror to the activities of the NAACP and to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, which declared segregated schools unconstitutional. His NAACP organizing travels convinced Evers that Jim Crow rendered the state a virtual closed society, and that mobilizing at the grassroots level was essential for building a movement for social change. It took 31 years to bring the assassin of Medgar Evers to justice. 2 weeks after the assassination, Byron D. LeBeckwith, a member of the local White Citizens Council, was arrested for Evers' murder. The following year, all-white juries twice failed to convict de LeBeckwith, stating that they were deadlocked. De LeBeckwith remained free until the 1990s, when, based on new evidence gathered by Merle Evers Williams and others, the case was reopened. In February 1994, de LeBeckwith was finally convicted, this time by a racially mixed jury, and sentenced to life in prison. He died in 2001 at the age of 90. Merle Evers Williams, who continued to be an activist in her own right, spoke about Medgar's contributions to the struggle. Medgar was a man who never wanted to be in the limelight, she said. He was a man who saw a job that needed to be done, and he answered the call and the fight for freedom, dignity, and justice, not just for his people, but all people.
Thank you very much, Paul. Medgar Evers presente. We'll have a short break now, and then we're going to come back with our guest who is on the phone. Sharon Black is calling in from Baltimore. Please stay tuned. We are back. So Sharon, hi. Thank you so much for calling into the Labor Forum today.
Hi, good morning.
Sharon Black is an organizer with the People's Power Assembly in Baltimore. She has been an activist in that city for several decades and has been at the forefront of so many different struggles, but the one that's kind of in the front pages right now is the struggle against police terror. And so we invited Sharon to speak a little bit about really what's happening in the city since the indictment of the 6 police who were involved in the murder of Freddie Grey, and also about the event that took place this last Saturday. It was a people's assembly about police terror and about the struggle for jobs and livable wages. So Sharon, again, thank you so much for taking the time, because it was a very busy period, and still is for you. Could you just let our listeners know a little bit, because there's not that much news coming out of Baltimore right now, if you could tell us about the pushback, what's happening in the communities following the indictment of these cops?
Well, there's been a lot that's happened since the indictment. First, let me thank you, Diane, for having us on the program, and I think the listeners should know that you're not just a radio show host, but you're an activist. And Diane, you came to Baltimore and were invaluable in your help, especially right after my car was shot at and also at the assembly. I just want to say the assembly that we held on Saturday was stupendously successful. Not only were we able to hear from a lot of people in the community in regard to police abuse and other police murders that have taken place in Baltimore City, but we were also able to pass a few very key, proposals or calls. And one of them that might be important for the rest of the country is a call for national days of protest on the anniversary of Ferguson, which is the weekend of August 8th and 9th, and it's coming up. So we're issuing a call, and I'm sure that others throughout the country will be issuing similar calls that we mark that anniversary with strong protest. Because there has been a kind of pushback in Baltimore. The cops have now made themselves look like they're the victims of all this. They are announcing that they're on slowdown. And now there's been like this whole propaganda campaign about black on black crime. Of course, they don't talk about rich on poor crime. They don't talk about white on black crime. So it's an effort to put the community in a defensive position. And there has been, a number of murders, and it's sort of the police answer to, Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the heroic rebellion or uprising of the youth here in Baltimore City. So now they want to turn the tables. So it's a propaganda war, and it's not just being conducted by the police, but everywhere on the airwaves from Fox 45, labeling youth thugs, there's been a strong call for amnesty for young people. So there's been a lot happening here, some of it not making the news. But so we're in this period where they're trying to turn the tables, and we're fighting hard to turn that around. And the next stage, at least in Baltimore City, will be the trials. Well, a couple of major things, but the trials for the cops are coming up. They have to appear in court, we believe, around July 2nd, so we'll be holding protests. We're not going to be deterred or intimidated. And also, calls for the venue to be changed. And then there's a lot of activity happening. On June 20th, a number of activists, particularly black women, who are holding demonstrations, which everyone is joining, of all nationalities, and of course men and women, for Black women and girls' lives matter. So there's big activity here on that on June 20th, 21st. So lots of stuff still happening. Of course, the big media is out of town now, but we think that'll change again. But just to underscore it, I know that Sister Diane asked me to raise this. Some of the repression has been leveled against the movement too, in terms of threats by right-wing threats, death threats. And just 2 days before the assembly, I had guests in out of town from South Central Los Angeles. Brother John Parker was here helping, and my son was here. We were coming back from the office, and we got into the house, but my car was shot up from both angles with a, 357 Magnum gun, and pretty much the car is now so damaged we can't drive it. It's in the shop, but we felt that was really a threat, a warning signal to us, which very honestly we went public on because we're not going to be deterred, we're not going to be intimidated. And other activists have been threatened and demonstrations called off because of that kind of thing. Because there's a very, very thin line between police and crime and the police. And in fact, they just recently, a cop was arrested for being a big heroin dealer in the city. So it's difficult, but the movement's still very strong here. So I've talked a little too long, Diane. I want to thank you personally for coming down in this kind of crisis and helping out, and that the assembly was such a stupendous success, and people did come out, they did testify, and we have figured out a course of action that we're going to be following in the next couple of months, including launching, and I should forget this, a citywide Know Your Rights Cop Watch campaign, which people are very committed to, because we've been calling for full community control of police, along with $15 an hour in a union, and addressing the structural problems of Baltimore City, which have to do with the, calling for reparations, getting the cops out of the community, and on and on. So, but I'll shut up. Thank you, Diane.
Well, there are two other folks here that are at the table. Jamu Baraka, who's going to be on starting at 4:30. We're going to be talking about these trade policies and actually how these treaties that are really formulated by the corporations end up impacting so negatively workers of all ages and areas of the country, but in particular black workers. And then of course Paul McLennan is a co-host of this program, and he's a retired ATU worker. So perhaps does anybody else have a question for Sharon?
Actually, I do. Thank you, Sharon. This is Ajamu. I wanted to. I think it might be interesting to the listeners to know what is the legal situation of the dozens of individuals who were arrested during the uprising in Baltimore.
That's a great question, and actually tomorrow morning we're mobilizing people to go to a trial of the young man who people probably saw on CNN, John Molman, who was tear gassed and arrested by police out in Pennsylvania, North Avenue, right in front of CNN. His trial's tomorrow. Now, we've been demanding this large demonstration for amnesty, and one of the a number of people for breaking the curfew. Those charges have been dropped on those people, but we still have to keep up the fight for amnesty and mobilize support for people who've been arrested. There was a young man, Alan Bullock, who we've been working very closely with his attorney, who people probably saw, who is facing life imprisonment for basically breaking out a cop car window. He was a gentleman that people saw on the major news media. So we're fighting around those cases, mobilizing people to go to court. There was a demonstration on the 16th calling for amnesty, a regional protest for the demonstrators. So it continues. There were so many people arrested, I think close to 500, that actually the state had to drop some charges because they couldn't process all of it. Who they're really targeting, though, is the most oppressed, obviously, the poorest, the black youth in particular, who they can try to seek out through photographs and that kind of thing that they think were involved with the rebellion. So it behooves the movement to stay very vigilant and make sure that we defend those who have heavier criminal charges on them, and don't forget those who have not been released yet. So tomorrow there is a trial. We're going to that tomorrow, and we're paying very close attention to Alan Bullock's case. He is out of jail. He got bailed out. Some anonymous people came forward. I don't want to speculate about who, but came forward with his $500,000 bail. People know that there's been a lot of celebrities who've come to Baltimore too, who've done stuff, so we're not sure, but this has to be anonymous, and the attorneys, they have been able to bail him out. So, and I know Jay Wendell Gordon is his attorney, and he's an excellent attorney, so we're fighting very hard for those youths who've not been, they may be out of jail, but they've not been cleared of their charges yet. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's sort of where we're at. It's major part of our program is for amnesty for those who are arrested.
Sharon, our time is almost up, and I want to ask you whether or not you can stay on the line when Ajamu does his discussion, particularly about
Yeah,
the,
yeah.
oh, super.